about what agencies he has. You should have a yellow piece of paper in front of you that lists all of those agencies.
Good morning. My name is Dayton Lemunyon. I'm a fiscal analyst with Legislative Research. It's nice to meet all of you. I'll be handling the Kansas Guardianship Program, the State Board of Mortuary Arts, the Board of Tax Appeals, the Board of Examiners in Optometry, the Board of Accountancy, the Board of Hearing Aid Examiners, the Kansas Lottery, the Pooled Money Investment Board, the Kansas Racing and Gaming Commission, and the Office of the State Treasurer. Looking forward to working with you all. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to introduce Harris Sheik. He is a legislative fellow with Legislative Research.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Harris Sheik. I'm a legislative fellow at KLRD, and I will be handling the budgets for the Abstractors Board of Examiners. I have Board of Tech Professions, the Office of Administrative Hearings. I also have Kansas Human Rights Commission, the Board of Barbering, and the Board of Cosmetology. Good to be here and looking forward to working with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome.
Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to take a moment to let the committee know that Aaron Clausen will be on extended medical leave and will not be with us this session. So you will see on the yellow piece of paper in front of you that his agencies have been temporarily redistributed among fiscal staff. So please contact those individuals. Also, we're passing around a Get Well card for Aaron, if you would be willing to sign that to send him some Get Well wishes. Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it over to the revisor's office and have Jesse or Jill introduce.
All right, thank you, Amy. Jill?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce our new staff member who's joining us this year, Jessie Pringle. Jessie is in her 4th year in the revisor's office, and also you might have seen her staffing children and families, or children and seniors. Children and seniors, excuse me. So that is her other assignment, and utilities. So you might have seen her in those committees. Just to let you know, Zach Friedel, who used to work for us, went to work for the city of Lawrence. And so Zach no longer works for the office. So Jessie will be joining me this year to assist me in all things money. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jill. Committee members, you will see that you have the rules all for the committee members and also for the conferees. They've been distributed out to all of you. One thing that I would like to keep in mind, if you notice, this year we are back to a sense of normalcy where all of us are sitting around the conference table as opposed to having everybody spread out throughout the entire committee room. But if there is somebody that wishes to participate by WebEx, please adhere to the rules. And if we are voting on any type of bill or amendments, that you need to be in the building if you're participating by WebEx in order to have your vote counted in the committee. Really, the next thing that I would like to discuss is how we're going to proceed for this legislative session. Obviously, yesterday we received the governor's budget, and I have to commend Representative Owens, who said this year we did not see the capers amortization in the governor's budget. And I was actually interviewed by members of the press yesterday, and I said, actually, this is one of the best budgets I've seen come from the governor's office, but there's going to be changes made. I didn't make the comment yesterday when we had the discussion with the Senate in regards to the governor's budget and how we're going to proceed this year, and so I was reserving that for today. And the reason why I kind of want to discuss this is, and this is mainly for the budget chairs. We had a meeting yesterday and talked about how we're going to strategize and move forward in the legislative session. And the one thing that I kind of described to the budget chairs is that this year is going to be somewhat different. I mean, obviously, we're looking at fiscal year 2023, and if you look at the profile, we are projected to have almost a $3.8 billion ending balance. I would just preface to all the committee members, and also I prefaced this to the budget chairs yesterday, is we have an opportunity right now to do great things for the state of Kansas, but we also want to be cognizant of the fact that this is not going to last forever. And there could be a possible recession in the upcoming years, and so we need to position ourselves to handle that recession if that should come. And so we need to identify one-time money, not having a long-term investment that is going for the state of Kansas that could impact the budget if we happen to enter in that recession. So we need to identify one-time money, and we have an opportunity to do a lot of great things for the state of Kansas. You know, in the budget, in the governor's budget, there was debt reduction, which I would say, as a former banker, we need to put money away, which obviously the governor had in her budget as well with the rainy day fund. But we also need to pay off debt. And so we need to analyze exactly how we want to structure that. The other thing that I mentioned yesterday with the budget chairs is that we're basically going to have almost, in essence, two budgets this session. You're going to have the budget for the state general fund, which we need to identify exactly what we need to do with the money that is in the surplus for the state. On the other hand, I would say that there's been a kind of a delay or a stagnant response in regards to the Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansas Committee. We're going to be starting the advisory panel meetings later this month. The timeline for those meetings is going to be starting in January, and they want to have the recommendations of how we want to spend the American Rescue Plan Act money by the end of March. That's $1.1 billion that the state has in non-discretionary funds that we're going to be deciding between the 4 advisory panels on how we want to address the funds the state of Kansas received from the federal government in regards to the ARPA money. So when we're looking at things this year, and I expressed this to the budget chairman, if there is something that could be classified as one-time spending and could go and be utilized with the ARPA funds, we need to analyze that and see if we can have that go to the respective advisory panels as opposed to being used from the state general fund. This committee is going to be looking at all of that. And we're going to have to be making the decision of whether or not that particular item could be spent in the state general fund or in the ARPA funds. Like I said, it's non-discretionary money for the state of Kansas. So I've had many meetings with Amy in regards to it, because I'm actually the chairman of the Government Modernization and Efficiency Advisory Panel with Spark. And there is still some questioning on what classifies as modernization and efficiency. But we have also the advisory panels of healthcare and education, connectivity, and economic development. And so we need to be very cognizant of the fact of looking at everything when we start analyzing the budgets of state agencies and departments of, can we not utilize state general fund money, and could that possibly be used in the advisory panels with the Spark Committee? And so I just wanted to make that statement. I didn't make it yesterday, but that is something that we need to be aware of when we are looking at the budgets for the state of Kansas. And because, like I said, this year is a little bit different. We had hoped that these advisory panels would be meeting during the interim, but they just hired an executive director in December, and so things have kind of got pushed back. And so now we're going to be having that parlayed with the legislative session, looking at the state budget as well as what monies could be utilized with the Spark Committee. And so I just kind of wanted to open it up and see if anybody had any questions or comments in regards for that. And so I see that Representative Wolfmore already has a comment. So
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything you said. I think that's the right way to proceed. Two things. I think part of the rub will come in this committee when we're trying to figure out, well, does that qualify for these federal Spark funds? I wonder, is there someone, and maybe it's Amy, I don't know, that could at some point give us a little primer on what qualifies, what doesn't, so we kind of know that going in, at least have a vague idea would be the first question, because we ran into that so many times last year.
And that's actually a very good question, and that's something that Amy and I have discussed, and we have met and kind of just brainstormed some ideas. Amy, you can jump in whenever you want, or if I say something that's incorrect. But when we were doing the brainstorming sessions on regards to what could be used for the ARPA funds, it was pretty much open. Obviously, you kind of want to have some type of relation to the pandemic for those ARPA funds. But for the aspect of looking at those dollars, it's pretty much open from the federal government. Amy, did you want to add to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are some specific items that are not permitted, and we can get those drafted and distributed to remind you. For example, you can't use it to backfill the pension system. So there are some very specific things that it cannot be used for, but we can get those drafted and distributed.
Well, and when we had the CSG Midwest meeting, I was the chairman of the state's financial stability committee, and we had a discussion in regards to the ARPA funds. So Amy is correct. It cannot go towards pensions. It cannot also go towards a state's rainy day fund. We cannot put that in there. But for I guess the aspects of what was passed by Congress, it's pretty open. There's some specifics on what the money cannot be used for, but we'll just have to make the decision in here and whether or not we want to relay that to the particular advisory panel on analyzing whether or not the ARPA funds can be used for that. Representative Wolfmore.
And then my second question, and maybe we don't know this yet, I am getting continually asked, since you brought up the advisory panels, how's the process going to work? How does someone submit? I know some people are already generating requests. Do you know what the pathway is for that or how that works? Actually,
on Tuesday, I had a meeting with the new executive director who is going to be kind of spearheading the Spark advisory panels. And we were kind of going through how the process would be. There's still some questions out there exactly how we're going to funnel out all the requests and everything. So what really is going to happen is you basically start with brainstorming ideas. And you submit those to the individual advisory panels if that is where the money should go in that respective advisory panel. And then the advisory panel then look at that and see exactly how much money that would, one, cost, and two, what would be the benefit to the state. And then the advisory panel then analyzes that, and then it breaks down, and then we make a recommendation from the advisory panel to the Spark Executive Committee. The Spark Executive Committee then will decide whether or not that will be forwarded on to the State Finance Council for final authority. And so the State Finance Council is the one that will ultimately approve the money that's going to be used for the ARPA funds in regards to whatever the request was from the advisory panel. The one question that has not been determined is, like I said, the state of Kansas received a total of $1.6 billion from the federal government, and that's the non-discretionary funds. So that is the amount that the state of Kansas will be looking at and dispersing in the Spark Committee. Now, $500 million of that has already been passed in regards to the Unemployment Trust Fund. So we're looking at a total amount of $1.1 billion that is going to be dispersed from the advisory panels to the Spark Executive Committee and then to the State Finance Council for final authority. Now, there is no definitive dollar amount that is specified for each of the advisory panels as of yet. They're looking at seeing whether or not we want to break that down and see whether or not each advisory panel will have approximately $300 million to look at. I expressed to the executive director, I don't think that's prudent because you may have, I'm just going to say this out right now, economic development may need more than that. So I don't see where you need to have actually a bucket of money dispersed to each advisory panel because there may be more of a preference on a different advisory panel than the other. The other thing is depending on what Congress does with the infrastructure bill, connectivity is part of that. And so that would be paid for by the federal government if they would happen to pass the infrastructure bill. And so then that advisory panel would then not really need anything because broadband would be considered in the federal bill. So there's a lot of moving parts with this. And so right now there's no specific dollar amount that is affixed to each advisory panel. It's going to be what our recommendation is going to be to the executive committee with Spark, and then they will make the determination on how much money is going to be allocated for that particular item, and then the State Finance Council will then ultimately decide.
That's very helpful, Mr. Chair. If you, and then I'll let somebody else ask questions. If an outside group approaches us and says, hey, we're interested in approaching the Spark Advisory, the one we happen to sit on, for example, what is their process? Do they go direct? How do they submit their idea? Or is that known yet?
I would say it's not particularly known yet, but I would suggest that if anybody in the public or also anybody in the legislature or anybody, if you happen to be participating in the committee hearings with the budget committees, has an idea that could possibly go towards the Spark advisory panels and be used for ARPA funds as opposed to the state general fund, you just relay an email to that particular chairman of the advisory panel and let them know, like, hey, I think this is a great idea that could possibly be used with the ARPA funds as opposed to being paid by the state general fund.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Representative Helgerson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, some of us are a little bit behind because we didn't get information during the summer, and as to membership, amounts of funds, any particulars that may have been supplied to the various committees involved in this. So I'd ask if that could be made available to all of us.
Yes, I can make that available so you are aware of who the members of each advisory panel are, and also specifically the chairman of those advisory panels.
And now to the question. There's real serious concerns that I have that we passed the enabling legislation to this group and took it out of the appropriation process. And now, even though we're moving through a legislative session, it's still staying outside the legislative process. Historically, Finance Committee didn't make these kind of decisions, nor did we have an independent body or group of people making these kind of decisions outside the legislature during session. Those Finance Committee is set up to deal with those things, especially when we're not here. But we're here. And I have real reservations, you know, and about setting up this and continuing it. And who knows if it's going to continue now or through the next year. I would like some more discussion about maybe bringing their recommendations back to the committees and having them review. I'll speak just for myself. I have real reservations. I had it last year turning it over to an independent group, an independent body with some legislative intent with the governor involved. But I have even more taking away our responsibilities to independent groups.
And I would say I share your reservations as well. When we passed the budget bill last year, there was a provision in there that this was the final budget bill that we passed, because in the initial budget bill that we passed, it was actually the LCC who was going to be looking at all of the money that was coming from the federal government and how that was going to be dispersed throughout the state of Kansas. That was vetoed by the governor. And so then we negotiated with the governor's office, and this was the process that was set up. And this is not the same process, but very similar process when we received the CARES Act money. Not saying it's perfect, because I was, and a lot of members on this committee were also on the Spark Committee task force when we went through the CARES Act money. But that was the process that was negotiated with the second floor in regards to how we're going to disperse this money. I agree with you. We can have the Office of Recovery, we can have the advisory panels when they make their recommendations come before this committee and basically tell us exactly how, what they determined as being the appropriate manner of spending those funds and what those particular items are going to be spent for. Representative Helgerson.
Well, just like we do supplementals or emergency appropriation bills, how would it be viewed if we told them that their recommendations are going to be put into a piece of legislation and run through this committee then too, through the legislature?
If we would happen to have a supplemental budget bill, that would be something that we can discuss in this committee. Like I said before, the intent, I think before we started the assignment of the advisory panels and how the money was going to be dispersed by Spark, I think the intention was we would not be in session.
I agree.
And as for myself, I thought we were going to start this process back in September. It was delayed because they wanted to hire an executive director. That didn't happen until December. And now we're finding ourselves in the calendar of being the same time as the legislative session. And so that's why I wanted to preface that today, is that we're going to be almost looking at two different separate budgets for the state general fund and then also what we have with the ARPA funds during this legislative session. The intent, I believe, was to have this done in the interim. That didn't happen. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And now we're going to be in the position of looking at both of these at the same time. Representative Helgerson.
Well, if the chairman is agreeable, I will probably put some modification of some language that could be introduced to the committee about ideas that I might have and share it with anyone and see if there's any interest in modifying the process.
Okay, thank you. Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it appears that the committee will not have the extra committee you're talking about that you're on will not have any decisions till after our budget is prepared, correct?
We could barely hear you, Representative Landwehr. Can we turn up the volume?
Okay. It appears that the committee will not have the committee you're on will not have any decisions until after our budget is prepared, the first budget anyway. Is that correct?
Given the timeline, I would say it's going to be, yeah, it'd be very close. Because right now all the recommendations are going to be relayed to the executive committee with Spark by the end of March. Most likely we would already have our budget prepared by the middle of March. That's why when we met with the budget chairs yesterday, it was to be aware of looking at any type of funding or monies that could be spent with ARPA for one-time money, and then have that relayed to the advisory panels, and then we could look at it. And if it's not approved by the Spark Executive Committee, and it's not in our initial budget before we go on our break on April 1st, then we would come back and analyze that in veto session.
Okay, so, and if I understand correctly, though, the state finance council has the decision of how that 1.1 will be spent, not the legislature. Is that correct?
According to the budget bill that was passed in the 2021 legislative session, that is the language of any federal money that comes into the state of Kansas. The ultimate authority goes down to the State Finance Council for approval.
So it is possible to do what Representative Hilgerson was referring to if we could get agreement between the House, the Senate, and the governor to pass a quick piece of legislation that just basically puts that authority back to the legislature. Would that be correct?
That would be, yeah, that'd be correct.
You know, I would hope that our committee would take serious consideration of that and then have conversations with the leadership in both chambers. There's no sense in going through the motions of trying to pass a bill if it's only going to be vetoed. Because it makes it pretty tough. It makes it pretty tough to sit here and prepare budgets and kind of, as you say, kind of having two budgets. So you're earmarking some things for the 1 billion to be used. And there may be extras that if it didn't happen, okay, not a major issue, but there may be where you could use that for the initial, you know, in our budget process, and have language that then says, and this is where it's going to get confusing, and I think very tough on our staff as well, that, you know, we will recommend this money from the $1.1 billion pot, but if not available, then SGF is the backup.
And that's something we can discuss in this committee as well.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions in regards to the 2022 legislative session? Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, committee. Is there a deadline for spending this money?
It's not like the CARES Act money. The CARES Act money, when it was initially passed, said we had to spend the money by December 30th of 2020. The ARPA funds actually goes into 2024. So there is not that stringent deadline that was passed with the CARES Act money.
Okay. As a for instance, one of the things that I think would be relevant and that I've looked at is a grant system for daycare startups, for instance, where we could encumber that money and then have some kind of an application process for that money to start a daycare. The details are obviously not worked out yet, but if that's the case, we could encumber that money for that and have a grant process for daycare startup then.
And that would be an idea that could be relayed to, I believe, Chairman Tarwater is economic development on the advisory panel.
Very good. Thank you.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we talked a bit about what we can do with the federal funds and can't. I wondered if the federal funds cause any restriction on what we do with the general budget as it relates to debt reduction and tax reduction, if there are limitations on that, or if we're pretty free on that.
I believe there were limitations in regards to debt reduction and also taxation, but Amy can follow up on that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we can get you some more information. I believe there has been a legal challenge to the requirement on the limiting your tax reductions, so we can certainly get you a status of that legal challenge.
Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to follow up on part of a question from Representative Landwehr. Was there any specific reason why we went to finance? Do we always put outside monies to finance?
State Finance Council. Basically, this is when we passed the provision in the budget bill last year, it was similar to how the money was handled with the CARES Act money. Now, granted, the makeup of the SPARK committees has altered a little bit, because with the CARES Act money, we had a task force, we had a 5-member executive committee, and then the State Finance Council approved whatever the executive committee relayed to the State Finance Council. As I mentioned before, when I think Representative Helgerson asked his question, when we had the discussion last legislative session on what would happen with federal money that came into the state of Kansas, the initial amendment that passed in this committee was that the LCC would have the final approval. That was vetoed by the governor. In discussions with the governor, we then set up the same kind of makeup with the Spark committee, except you had these advisory panels that were initiated. And then the Spark Executive Committee was expanded beyond 5 members to have actually more members and more members of the legislature. And then they make the recommendation to the State Finance Council. And that was all set up in the proviso that was in the budget bill last year.
And basically, by doing that, it really does take legislators out of the process initially.
In the advisory, yes, it does. Oh, I would say yes, it does, in essence. All of the chairpersons of the advisory panels and also most of the ranking members on those advisory panels are legislators. So you still have a legislative process or legislative members on that. You also have more legislators on the executive committee who then make the recommendation to the State Finance Council.
So my last question would be, on this, so when the federal funds come in, we get it to the state. So does that take some of that power away from the governor by putting it all in the finance committee? Or I'm trying to think what's the most efficient way to do it?
This would be my contention, is that no, it doesn't, because the governor calls the State Finance Council and makes the agenda items. And if there is something that she would possibly not like that was recommended by the Spark Executive Committee, she sets the agenda for the State Finance Council.
Okay. Well, then I would be in agreement that rather than trying to pass a bill, if that's something that we can do ourselves, which makes it more efficient, we probably should look at that. But unless we have to have a bill itself, I think that's what the question is. Do we have to have the bill to have it official? Or if we just do it ourselves, do we ultimately going to have to end up there?
And that would be, I mean, that you would have to have a bill to negate what was on the budget bill last year, because that was passed and signed by the governor and is now existing law.
That's my question. Thank you very much.
Representative Helgerson.
Following that up, though, if I wanted to put a proviso on and a single appropriation for the next year, Jill, and correct me if I'm wrong, would that not take precedent over a non-action by the committee? If the committee doesn't take action or has not taken action on giving out the funds, and I put a proviso that says I'm, irregardless of what the legislature passed last year with regards to this ARCO committee, we are appropriating X dollars from this fund toward this purpose, we already spent the money.
Jill, did you have a?
That controls the proviso.
If it was an official enacted law that the governor signed, yes, sir, that would control over the previous information.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions in regards to, actually, I didn't expect that much of a discussion on this, but it's good, though. I mean, because, like I said, I didn't want to mention it yesterday because we had some time constraints because redistricting was needing to have the room yesterday at noon, so I didn't express these comments yesterday, but I wanted to have the discussion with the committee members because, like I said before, I mean, basically, we're going to have 2 separate budgets moving through the legislative session. That was not the initial intent. as I mentioned before, and Representative Wolfmore agreed with me, and we thought this process was going to be starting during the interim. Unfortunately, it didn't. And now we find ourselves during the legislative session looking at both of those. Representative Carlin.
Thank you. Just a comment, Mr. Chair. During the, it's okay. I do want you to hear. During the distribution of the ARA funds under Obama, we did that through this committee. And it worked very well. And then I think it's a great idea. I hadn't thought about it, but it is a great idea. And it gives us the opportunity to identify those one-time spending things with people who are working the budgets all the time. And I know in water or whatever, we can identify easily whether it's one-term spending for water or not and whatever. Whereas your advisory panels have maybe less experience with some of that. So I think it's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a kind of two-part question. So the advisory panels would probably be reporting out to us regardless, whichever direction we went, correct?
I can put that on the agenda, yes.
Yes, okay. So if we were to do it the way that Representative Helgerson suggested, then we would need to add on additional days of time for this committee, most likely, correct?
Most likely, yes.
Okay. And then my second question is really more related to process of this committee. May I ask it now or shall I wait?
No, you may ask it.
So I was just looking over this and you may have mentioned it. So we are back to full paper?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll get the week or the daily agenda. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Thank you.
And the other thing I would like to express in regards to that comment is we are going to be having the budget books printed out. I think they're going to be electronically as well, but for the members of this committee, we'll actually have a physical printed out copy of all the budget books that we can analyze. And so I would just basically state to all of the members of the committee when we look at those budgets to look through those pages on the respective budgets that we're looking at those days. The same thing that I've expressed in previous years. That way we can look at all the details of the particular budgets. Any other questions or comments? All right, I'm not seeing any. Actually, I mean, I'll take all of the questions and comments that were made today in regards to the Spark advisory panels. And we will be having probably routine updates from the Office of Recovery as we did during our legislative budget committee meetings during the interim. I think every single meeting we had an update from the Office of Recovery in regards to how the process is going to be moving forward. And we'll be continuing that in this committee and finding out exactly how things are going to be progressing with the advisory panels and then also with the Spark Executive Committee. You'll notice that we do not have a committee meeting on Tuesday. So actually we are adjourned until Wednesday, January 19th.